Think you're tough because you survived that CrossFit class last week? You wouldn't last a single morning in the Viking Age. Modern life has turned us all into soft, climate-controlled weaklings, and what the Norse dealt with daily would send you running back to your heated car faster than you can say, "Where's the nearest Starbucks?" Let's be honest. Your idea of Viking life probably comes from Hollywood movies with Chris Hemsworth looking fabulous in perfectly clean armor. The reality? Vikings were basically the world's most successful combination of farmers, traders, raiders, and survival experts, living in conditions that would make a Navy SEAL weep into his protein shake. So grab your participation trophy and settle in, because we're about to destroy every romantic notion you have about Viking life. Fair warning, by the end of this, you'll be kissing your thermostat and thanking whatever gods you believe in for indoor plumbing. Your Viking day starts at 4 a.m., not because you set an alarm, but because the rooster's crow means it's time to check if everyone in your household survived the night. No snooze button, no coffee maker gurgling to life, just the immediate reality that people actually died in their sleep from cold, illness, or raids. Vikings didn't wake up and check their phones. They woke up and checked their weapons. Every single morning started with a weapons inspection, because you never knew if today was the day your neighbors decided your farm looked better than theirs. Archaeological evidence from 9th century Scandinavian settlements shows that weapons were kept within arm's reach of every sleeping area. Modern people panic when their phone battery dies. Vikings panicked when their axe handle felt loose. The first task of every day, starting the fire. Not flicking a switch, actually creating fire from scratch using flint, steel, and tinder. Recent experiments by archaeologists show this process took an average of 15 to 20 minutes for an experienced person. Miss a step, and you're eating cold porridge while slowly freezing to death. But here's where it gets interesting. Vikings were so good at fire starting that they developed portable fire-making kits that were more reliable than some modern lighters. One archaeological find from a 10th century burial contained a fire kit so well designed that researchers were able to use it to start a fire over 1,000 years after it was made. Talk about product reliability. The morning fire wasn't just for warmth, it was for survival. Vikings used it to heat their one-room houses, cook their food, provide light for indoor work, and create smoke that helped preserve meat hanging from the rafters. Letting the fire die was basically a death sentence. Villages actually had fire wardens whose job was to maintain a community backup fire in case individual household fires went out. Your modern morning beverage routine would get a serious upgrade too. Forget your fancy coffee drinks. Vikings started their day with ale. Not because they were party animals, but because brewing ale was one of the few ways to make liquid safe to drink. Archaeological analysis of Viking-era ale residues shows it was much weaker than modern beer, around 2 to 3% alcohol content, but Vikings drank it with every meal. Your morning coffee addiction will be replaced by a mild beer buzz before 5 a.m. Forget your avocado toast and overnight oats. Viking breakfast was a calculated survival strategy disguised as a meal. The typical morning meal consisted of porridge made from barley, oats, or rye, but this wasn't your creamy, Instagram-worthy breakfast bowl. This was a dense, often gritty mixture that could keep you alive through hours of backbreaking labor. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows they ate the same basic porridge almost every morning for centuries, but they were geniuses about maximizing its nutritional value. They'd add whatever protein they could find, dried fish, bits of preserved meat, or if they were lucky, some eggs. Modern nutritional analysis of recreated Viking porridge shows it provided nearly 600 calories per bowl and contained all the essential amino acids needed for survival. The really clever part was how they prepared it. Vikings would start their porridge the night before, letting the grains soak and begin fermenting. This process broke down the tough grain fibers and created beneficial bacteria that helped with digestion. They accidentally invented overnight oats about 1,200 years before it became a health trend. Laboratory analysis shows this fermentation process increased the bioavailability of nutrients by up to 40%. But here's where Viking breakfast gets really intense. They ate it fast and in complete silence. This wasn't about mindful eating or savoring flavors. Archaeological evidence suggests Vikings could consume their morning meal in less than 10 minutes because dawdling meant vulnerable time when raiders could attack. Viking table manners consisted of eat quickly, stay alert, keep your weapon handy. The portions were massive by modern standards. Studies of Viking bone density and muscle attachment points suggest they regularly consumed 3,000 to 4,000 calories daily during active seasons. Their breakfast alone provided more calories than many modern people eat in an entire day. But they needed every single calorie. Viking daily life burned energy like a Formula One race. Carb burns fuel. Vikings also had something modern nutritionists are just catching on to. They ate seasonally without choice. Recent studies of Viking bone chemistry show their diet was incredibly diverse across seasons, providing a range of nutrients that many modern diets lack. They fermented everything they could, grains into beer, fruits into wine, vegetables into preserves that would make modern probiotics look amateur. Think your job is hard? Try Viking work, where a bad performance review meant starving to death, and there was no HR department to complain to when your boss, usually yourself, demanded 16-hour workdays. Let's start with farming, which occupied about 80% of Viking life. This wasn't modern farming with tractors and irrigation systems. This was hand-to-hand combat with the soil using tools that were basically sharp sticks. Vikings used a simple wooden plow called an ard that barely scratched the surface of the earth. Archaeological experiments show it took an entire day to plow 1 acre using Viking methods. Modern farmers can plow 100 acres in the same time while sitting in an air-conditioned cab listening to podcasts. The physical demands were staggering. Studies of Viking skeletal remains show bone density and muscle attachment points that suggest superhuman strength by modern standards. The average Viking man had a grip strength of over 200 pounds, twice that of modern men. These people didn't need gyms. Their daily work was basically CrossFit combined with manual labor Olympics. But farming was just the beginning. Vikings were also craftsmen, traders, builders, and warriors, often all in the same week. The shipbuilding alone would crush modern workers. Viking longships required cutting and shaping massive oak trees using only hand tools. Recent reconstructions show it took 40 skilled craftsmen working full-time for 6 months to build a single longship. Every plank had to be split from living trees, shaped with hand axes and fitted with wooden pegs. Trading expeditions meant months of traveling through dangerous territory while carrying valuable goods. Archaeological evidence shows Viking trade routes extended from Greenland to Constantinople, a distance that would challenge modern international businesses. These guys made international commerce work without email, GPS, or even maps in many cases. The seasonal work patterns would break modern people accustomed to steady schedules. Spring meant 18-hour days preparing fields, planting crops, and repairing winter damage. Fall brought harvest time, weeks of nonstop work to gather and preserve food for winter. One failed harvest meant death, so there were no participation trophies for effort. Viking women's work was equally demanding and required skills that would challenge modern survival experts. They managed households, produced textiles from sheep to finished cloth, preserved food, brewed ale, and often defended the homestead when men were away. Modern homemakers with dishwashers and grocery stores have an easier job than Viking women with stone tools and hostile environments. The work week didn't exist. Vikings worked every day the weather allowed, and when weather prevented outdoor work, they shifted to indoor tasks. Rest days happened when you were sick, injured, or dead. Child labor wasn't controversial, it was necessary. Children started working by age 5, and by age 10, they were doing adult-level work in specialized areas. Think modern social dynamics are complicated? Try Viking society, where your social standing could literally determine whether you lived or died, and social media meant the stories people told about you around the fire, stories that could follow you across continents and through generations. Privacy didn't exist in Viking culture. Most families lived in single-room longhouses where everything from childbirth to death happened in full view of everyone else. Archaeological evidence from reconstructed longhouses shows spaces designed for 10 to 20 people living in what modern people would consider a large bedroom. Your idea of privacy, closing your bedroom door, would have been as foreign to Vikings as time travel. The social hierarchy was rigid but not impossible to change. Vikings had jarls, nobles, carls, free farmers, and thralls, slaves. but you could move between these classes through success in battle, trade, or exceptional skill. However, moving up usually meant someone else was moving down, often permanently. Social mobility in Viking society was like musical chairs, except when the music stopped, losers often ended up dead or enslaved. Viking social gatherings weren't casual hangouts. They were strategic networking events with life or death implications. The famous Viking feasts were political summits disguised as parties. Archaeological evidence from great halls shows seating arrangements that reflected complex political alliances, trade relationships, and military agreements. Where you sat at dinner could determine whether your family survived the next raiding season. Reputation was everything, and it followed you everywhere. Vikings lived in an honor-based society where your reputation determined your access to trade, marriage prospects, military alliances, and even basic survival assistance. Modern cancel culture has nothing on Viking reputation destruction. Get caught lying, showing cowardice, or breaking oaths, and you wouldn't just lose followers, you'd lose access to the social networks that kept you alive. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about political alliance, economic cooperation, and survival strategy. Archaeological evidence shows Viking marriages were essentially business mergers designed to combine resources, skills, and political connections. Viking marriage counseling consisted of economic negotiation and threat assessment. Romance was a luxury for people who had already solved the problem of not dying. The storytelling tradition wasn't entertainment. It was education and propaganda combined. Sagas served as legal precedent, historical record, moral instruction, and social control. Vikings who couldn't remember and recite the relevant stories were at a severe disadvantage in legal disputes and social negotiations. Being a good storyteller wasn't just about being popular. It was about having the knowledge necessary to navigate society successfully. Modern people complain when it's too hot for their daily jog or too cold for their morning commute. Vikings lived in weather that was actively trying to murder them, and they didn't have weather apps to warn them it was coming. Scandinavian winters weren't just cold, they were apocalyptic. During the Little Ice Age, average temperatures were 2 to 3 degrees Celsius colder than today. That might not sound like much until you realize it meant the difference between liquid water and ice, between a growing season and famine, between survival and death. Archaeological evidence shows abandoned settlements across Scandinavia as communities simply couldn't survive the extended cold. Viking houses were marvels of cold weather engineering, but they were still basically sophisticated caves. The typical longhouse was partially underground, with thick sod walls and a central fire that burned continuously for months. Recent reconstructions show these houses could maintain internal temperatures around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius when it was minus 20 degrees Celsius outside, barely above freezing. The clothing technology was incredible but uncomfortable by modern standards. Vikings wore multiple layers of wool, linen, and fur, but everything was handmade and required constant maintenance. Archaeological analysis shows incredibly sophisticated weaving techniques that created water-resistant and insulating fabrics. However, these clothes were also heavy, scratchy, and impossible to wash properly. Vikings chose warmth over comfort because comfort was a luxury that could kill you. Weather prediction was crucial but primitive. Vikings relied on natural indicators like animal behavior, cloud patterns, and traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Recent studies show Viking weather lore was surprisingly accurate, about 70% reliable for short-term predictions. However, missing the other 30% could mean death. Storms weren't just inconvenient. They were potentially catastrophic events that could destroy months of work and hours. Modern people experience storms from inside climate-controlled buildings. Vikings experienced them while trying to save their animals, protect their food stores, and prevent their houses from being destroyed. Snow wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a months-long siege by nature itself. Heavy snow could isolate communities for weeks, making hunting impossible and forcing complete reliance on stored food. Archaeological analysis shows Vikings had to carefully ration everything during severe winters, including fuel for fires. Running out of firewood didn't just mean being cold, it meant death. Think modern healthcare is expensive? Try Viking medicine, where the cost of treatment was often higher than the cost of dying, and your insurance policy was basically don't get sick in the first place. Viking medical knowledge was a bizarre combination of practical folk wisdom, religious ritual, and treatments that would make modern doctors either impressed or horrified. Archaeological evidence shows they performed sophisticated surgical procedures, including trepanation, limb amputations, and even primitive dental work. The impressive part wasn't the procedures themselves. It was that patients sometimes survived them without anesthesia, antibiotics, or basic sanitation. Pain management was brutal by modern standards. Vikings used alcohol, herbal preparations, and physical restraint to deal with surgical pain. Recent analysis of preserved Viking medical tools shows they understood the importance of speed in surgery. The faster you worked, the less time the patient had to die from shock or blood loss. Dental care was particularly horrific. Archaeological analysis of Viking skulls shows evidence of dental problems that would send modern people straight to the emergency room. Tooth extraction was performed using crude metal tools without pain relief. Vikings dealt with dental pain by drinking alcohol until they passed out, or having someone knock them unconscious before the procedure. Women's healthcare during pregnancy and childbirth was particularly dangerous. Archaeological evidence shows maternal mortality rates around 30%, meaning nearly 1 in 3 women died in childbirth. Viking midwives had sophisticated knowledge of herbal preparations and birthing techniques, but they were working without the medical tools that make modern childbirth survivable. Disease outbreaks were devastating because Vikings lived in close quarters with limited understanding of contagion. Archaeological evidence shows entire settlements abandoned due to disease, with no one left alive to bury the dead. Vikings dealt with epidemics through isolation, prayer, and hoping it would pass. Herbal medicine was sophisticated but dangerous. Recent analysis of Viking medical texts shows they had detailed knowledge of hundreds of plants and their effects. However, this knowledge was passed down orally and could be lost if the local healer died. Learning medicine meant practicing on people who had no other options. After surviving a single day of Viking challenges, the brutal wake-up routine, the survival-based breakfast, the back-breaking work, the lethal social dynamics, the murderous weather, and the terrifying healthcare system, you'd face the ultimate Viking reality, doing it all again tomorrow and every day until you died. Because that's what made Vikings truly extraordinary. It wasn't just that they could survive one day of these conditions, they built an entire civilization while living this way for generations. They didn't just endure, they thrived, explored, traded, created art, told stories, raised families, and left a cultural legacy that still influences us today. Modern people have the luxury of thinking about self-actualization and work-life balance. Vikings had to focus on not dying, which freed them to become incredibly good at living. They developed skills, strength, resilience, and community bonds that most modern people can't imagine. So the next time you complain about your commute, your job, your weather, or your healthcare, remember that somewhere in history, a Viking would have considered your worst day to be a vacation. The question isn't really whether you could survive a day in the Viking Age, it's whether you could develop the mental toughness, physical capability, and social resilience that made everyday survival possible for people who had no choice but to be extraordinary. And honestly, most of us probably couldn't. But maybe understanding what Vikings actually endured can help us appreciate both how far we've come and how capable humans can be when survival is on the line.